The dust was a character in Silas Blackwood's life. It coated the sills of his farmhouse, settled in the deep lines around his eyes, and rose in resentful plumes with every step he took across the parched fields. For 3 generations, the Blackwood family had drawn life from this soil, but now it offered only brittle stalks and the bitter taste of failure. The foreclosure notice, tacked to his front door by a man who hadn't bothered to look him in the eye, fluttered in the hot, indifferent wind. It was a stark white flag of surrender he refused to wave. Every morning, he'd pull it down, fold it, and place it under a chipped ceramic mug in the kitchen, only for the bank's persistence to nail a fresh one in its place by afternoon. Today was different. Today, the nail had been driven through a photograph of his late wife, Eleanor, that he'd hung on the door. A small, faded image of her smiling amidst a field of sunflowers that now seemed like a fantasy from another world. The violation felt more profound than any legal threat. It was a desecration of memory, a final, cruel twist of the knife. Silas stood on his porch, the splintered wood groaning under his weight, and stared at the man climbing back into a sleek air-conditioned sedan. The man, no older than Silas's own son would have been, adjusted his tie and drove away without a backward glance, leaving a cloud of that same accusatory dust to settle over everything. Silas felt a hollowness that had nothing to do with the hunger gnawing at his stomach. It was the hollowness of being erased. His hands, gnarled and stained with the earth he loved, clenched into fists. He was 72 years old. His back was a roadmap of pain, his savings a ghost, and his legacy a crumbling barn held together by stubbornness and rust. The community in the small town of Harmony Creek, which once thrived on the principle of neighborly support, had grown quiet. They saw his struggle, the slow decay of his ancestral land, and they offered pity in hushed tones at the general store, but never help. They were afraid. The force pressing down on Silas wasn't just a bank. It was a corporate behemoth, Sterling Development, a company that devoured family farms like his and spat out soulless suburbs. Their shadow had fallen over the entire valley, and no one wanted to be caught in it. Silas was an obstacle, a relic. He was the last holdout. Later that day, he drove his sputtering Ford truck into town for supplies he couldn't afford. The truck's engine coughed with a dry, rattling sound that mirrored the ache in his own chest. At the diner, the usual hub of local gossip, conversations dwindled as he entered. He took his regular seat at the counter, a spot worn smooth over decades of use, and ordered a black coffee. He didn't have the money for a meal. He nursed the coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to warm the chill of his isolation. He was a ghost at the feast, a living reminder of a past they were all eager to forget in the face of so-called progress. The bell over the door chimed, and a man in a suit so sharp it could have cut glass walked in. Silas recognized him instantly from the brochures that had been stuffed into every mailbox. Marcus Thorne, the face of Sterling Development. Thorne possessed an aura of predatory confidence. His smile was a well-practiced instrument of disarming charm, but his eyes were cold, calculating chips of granite. He strode to the center of the diner, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum, and clapped his hands together as if addressing a boardroom. "Folks, a pleasure to be in Harmony Creek again. Progress is on the horizon." His gaze swept the room and landed, with theatrical precision, on Silas. He walked over, his smile widening, and slid onto the stool next to him. The whole diner fell silent, watching. "Silas Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The man, the myth, the legend. The last holdout. He patted Silas on the back, a gesture that was meant to look friendly but felt like a blow. Silas didn't flinch. He just stared into his coffee cup. "I've been trying to reach you, Silas," Thorne continued, feigning sincerity. "We have a very generous offer on the table. More than generous, considering the state of, well, everything." He gestured vaguely toward the window, in the direction of Silas's farm. The humiliation was a physical thing, a heat that crawled up Silas's neck. Thorne was turning his private struggle into a public spectacle. "My land isn't for sale," Silas said, his voice low and raspy but firm. Thorne chuckled. a condescending sound that grated on the nerves. "Let's be honest, old-timer. It's not really your land anymore, is it? The bank seems to think it's theirs. I'm offering you a way out, a chance to walk away with some dignity. A little cash in your pocket for your golden years." The phrase golden years was laced with such mockery that a few people in the diner shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But no one spoke up. They just watched, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. "This farm has been in my family for 100 years, Silas said, finally looking at Thorne. His eyes, though weary, held a flicker of unyielding fire. "It's not about cash. It's about a promise." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still audible in the tense silence. "Promises don't pay bills. History doesn't stop a bulldozer. I'm giving you 48 hours, Silas. Sign the papers, take the money, or the bank will foreclose, and you'll walk away with nothing but the dirt under your fingernails. And I'll buy it from them for half of what I'm offering you now. The choice is yours. Be a smart man, not a sentimental fool." He stood up, placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter to cover Silas's coffee, and gave him another patronizing pat on the shoulder. "Don't be a stranger to progress," he said, then turned and walked out, leaving a wake of suffocating silence. The entire diner had heard. They had witnessed his degradation. Silas sat there, his back ramrod straight, staring at the $20 bill as if it were poison. He felt the weight of every gaze in the room. He was no longer just a struggling farmer. He was the town fool, the stubborn old man tilting at windmills. He slowly pushed the bill away, stood up, and placed 2 worn quarters on the counter. Then, without a word, he walked out, his dignity the only thing he had left. That evening, the farmhouse felt more cavernous and empty than ever before. The setting sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, indifferent spirits. Silas moved through the rooms with the slow, deliberate pace of a man walking through a museum of his own life. Every object was a repository of memory, a testament to a world that no longer existed. He ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the rocking chair by the hearth. It was Eleanor's chair. He could still see her sitting there, her knitting needles clicking a soft, rhythmic lullaby, a gentle smile on her face as she listened to the crackle of the fire. She had loved the changing seasons on this land, the vibrant green of spring, the golden expanse of a summer wheat field, the stark, quiet beauty of winter. "You can feel God's own breath out here, see," she used to say. It's honest after she was gone. The silence she left behind was a physical presence, a constant ache in the architecture of the house. In the corner of the living room stood a small, hand-carved wooden soldier, its paint faded and chipped. His son, David, had carved it when he was 12. A boy with his mother's smile and his father's love for the land. David had dreamed of taking over the farm, of installing new irrigation systems, of bringing Blackwood Farms into the modern age. But a dusty road in a country Silas couldn't find on a map had claimed him instead. The folded flag the army had given him was tucked away in a cedar chest upstairs, along with a single posthumous medal. The promise Silas had mentioned to Thorne wasn't just to his father or his grandfather. It was to Eleanor and to David. It was a vow to protect this small patch of earth that held the last tangible pieces of them. To sell it would be to sell their graves, to auction off their memory to the highest bidder. He walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Inside sat a half-full carton of milk, a small wedge of cheese, and a few wilting vegetables. His stomach rumbled, a hollow counterpoint to the grief in his heart. He ignored it. Hunger was a familiar companion. He sat at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice he'd retrieved from the door now lying flat before him. He traced the bold, impersonal letters of Sterling Development with a calloused finger. Marcus Thorne's words echoed in his mind. Sentimental fool. Was that what he was? A fool clinging to ghosts while the world moved on without him? He looked out the window at the fields bathed in the soft, purple light of twilight. He saw the ghosts of his father teaching him how to plow a straight furrow, of Eleanor planting her first rosebush by the porch, of a young David chasing fireflies in a jar. This land wasn't just dirt and fences. It was the story of his life, the geography of his soul. Giving it up wasn't a business transaction. It was an amputation. The weight of it all pressed down on him, a physical force that made his shoulders slump and his breath catch in his throat. He felt the sting of tears but refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't fix the broken pump or bring the rain or make the bank change its mind. He bowed his head, his forehead resting on his folded hands on the table. He didn't pray. He hadn't known how to since he'd lost Eleanor. Instead, he just sat there, absorbing the profound silence of the house. A captain going down with his ship, his only crew the specters of a love and a life that had been. The next 24 hours were a slow-motion torment. The deadline Thorn had set loomed like a guillotine. The morning brought a fresh notice on the door, this time with a final, ominous warning typed in red ink. Silas tore it down and burned it in the rusted barrel behind the barn, watching the ashes of the threat scatter on the wind. It was a small, futile act of defiance, but it was his. Later that morning, a team of surveyors from Sterling Development appeared at the very edge of his property line. They hammered stakes into the ground with a rhythmic, percussive clang that echoed across the fields, each strike a nail in his coffin. They were careful not to step onto his land, but their presence was a constant, invasive pressure. They were vultures, measuring his farm for its grave clothes. Silas tried to work. He went to the barn to fix a leak in the roof, his movements stiff and heavy. He climbed the ladder, his joints screaming in protest, and looked out over his domain. From up there, he could see the surveyors, small figures in bright orange vests, mapping out the end of his world. He could see the road leading into town, where people who had known him his whole life now averted their eyes. The silence from his neighbors was the cruelest cut of all. He knew they were afraid. He knew Thorn's company had offered some of them lucrative deals for smaller parcels, sowing division and fear. To stand with Silas was to stand against Sterling, and no one had the courage for that fight. A car would occasionally slow as it passed his farm, the driver's curiosity piqued by the surveyors, before speeding up again, unwilling to be associated with the unfolding tragedy. He received a call from the bank. A cold, impersonal voice informed him that if Sterling's offer was not accepted by tomorrow at noon, foreclosure proceedings would be finalized. There would be no more extensions, no more appeals. "Mr. Blackwood, it's just business," the voice said, devoid of any emotion. Silas hung up without replying. The phrase echoed Thorn's dismissal, just business. How could a man's entire life, his entire history, be reduced to such a sterile, heartless phrase? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of angry orange and bruised purple, Silas felt a profound sense of isolation. He was an island, and the tide was coming in. He sat on his porch, the rocking chair silent beside him, and watched the surveyors pack up their equipment and leave. They would be back. He knew they would. He was alone, besieged, and out of time. He thought about fighting, about meeting them at the property line with the old shotgun he kept over the mantelpiece. But what good would that do? It would only end with him in jail or worse, a mad old man making a foolish last stand. His dignity was all he had left. He wouldn't tarnish it with pointless violence. He would face tomorrow with the same quiet resolve he had faced every other day of his life. He would not sign Thorn's papers. He would let the bank take it. He would walk away with nothing, just as Thorn had predicted. But he would walk away with his promise to Eleanor and David intact. He would lose the land, but he would not sell it. In his mind, there was a world of difference. As darkness fully consumed the valley, the sky opened up. The rain started as a gentle patter on the tin roof of the barn, a sound that had once been a comfort, a promise of life for the thirsty crops. But tonight, it fell with a cold, relentless fury, turning the dusty driveway into a river of mud. The wind howled, rattling the window panes of the old farmhouse as if trying to find a way inside. It was a storm that matched the tempest in Silas's soul. He was sitting at his kitchen table, staring at a bowl of thin vegetable soup, he'd managed to conjure from the last of his supplies, when a sound cut through the roar of the wind and rain. It was a violent, metallic cough, followed by a sickening crunch and then a sudden, deadening silence. It came from the road at the edge of his property. Curiosity, or perhaps just a deep-seated instinct to respond to trouble, pulled Silas to his feet. He grabbed an old oilskin coat from a peg by the door and a heavy, battery-powered lantern. The light cut a weak, wavering beam into the torrential downpour. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the mud. The rain was cold and blinding, but he pushed forward, the lantern held high. Lying half in a ditch, contorted at an unnatural angle, was a massive motorcycle. It looked like a fallen beast of chrome and iron, its single headlight staring accusingly at the stormy sky. A few feet away, a large figure was trying to push himself up from the mud, his movements slow and pained. Silas approached cautiously. The man was huge, built like a mountain, with a long, graying beard matted with rain and mud. He wore a thick leather jacket, but it was soaked through. As Silas got closer, he saw a gash on the man's forehead, blood mingling with the rainwater streaming down his face. The man grunted in frustration and pain as he tried to lift the impossibly heavy bike. "Need a hand?" Silas asked, his voice nearly carried away by the wind. The stranger turned, his eyes squinting against the lantern's glare. He looked Silas up and down, a flicker of suspicion in his gaze. He was a man clearly accustomed to trouble and wary of strangers. "Bike's done for," the man growled, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Slipped on the mud. Damn near broke my leg." He gestured to his right leg, which was pinned awkwardly beneath him. Silas didn't hesitate. He waded into the ditch. "Let's get you out of this storm first." "The bike can wait." The stranger seemed to consider it for a moment, then nodded, a flicker of exhaustion overriding his suspicion. Silas was old, but his strength was the wiry, enduring kind forged from a lifetime of labor. Together, they managed to free the man's leg. The stranger leaned heavily on Silas as they limped through the mud toward the farmhouse. The man was silent, his breathing ragged. Once inside, the warmth of the house seemed to envelop them. Silas pointed to a sturdy wooden chair. "Sit. Let me look at that leg." The stranger eased himself down, his face pale under the kitchen light. Silas brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. As he knelt to gently clean the mud from the man's leg and the cut on his forehead, he noticed the worn, intricate tattoos that snaked up the man's arms. They were symbols Silas didn't recognize, but they spoke of a life very different from his own. The leg wasn't broken, but it was badly bruised and swelling. Silas wrapped it tightly with an elastic bandage. He then offered the man the bowl of soup he had been about to eat. "It's not much, but it's hot," Silas said. The stranger looked from the soup to Silas's face, a complex emotion in his eyes. He hadn't said a word since they'd come inside. He finally took the bowl. "Thank you," he said, the words gruff but sincere. "You can't go anywhere in this storm," Silas stated simply. "The road's a mess. You can have the barn for the night. It's dry and out of the wind." The stranger just nodded, eating the soup with a slow, deliberate hunger. Silas gave him a couple of thick wool blankets and led him out to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and old wood. He pointed to a clean, empty stall. "It's the best I can do." The stranger looked around the barn, at the neatly hung tools, the tidy stacks of hay, the evidence of a life of order and hard work. He looked at Silas, a man who, despite his obvious poverty, had offered a stranger his shelter and his last meal without asking a single question. "This is more than enough," the stranger said. "My name's Rook, Silas," the farmer replied, and with a simple nod, he left Rook in the quiet sanctuary of the barn and returned to his house to wait for the morning. Rook settled into the hay, the wool blankets a welcome warmth against the damp chill that had seeped into his bones. The pain in his leg was a dull, throbbing drumbeat, but it was the quiet of the barn that commanded his attention. It was a peaceful sound, a stark contrast to the constant roar of engines and the boisterous energy of the clubhouse that usually filled his world. He was a man who lived by a strict code of loyalty and respect, a code forged in chaos and violence. Kindness from strangers was a commodity he rarely encountered, and he was inherently suspicious of it. Yet the old farmer, Silas, had offered it without condition. Rook was the president of the Hell's Angel State Chapter, a leader of men who were feared and misunderstood. He commanded respect through strength and an unwavering, often brutal, sense of justice. He was not a man to be trifled with, and he did not accept charity. But tonight, stranded and injured, he lay back, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Through a crack in the barn door, he could see a single light on in the farmhouse kitchen. He saw Silas's silhouette as the old man sat at his table, his head bowed. He looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. Curiosity gnawed at Rook. What was this old farmer's story? Later, when the storm had quieted to a steady drizzle, Rook saw Silas come out onto the porch. The old man didn't seem to know he was being watched. He simply stood there, staring out into the darkness as if searching for an answer. After a long while, Silas went back inside. A little later, the phone rang. Even from the barn, Rook could hear the faint, muffled sound of Silas's voice, calm and measured, but laced with a profound weariness. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of a man being backed into a corner, a man refusing to break but bending under immense pressure. The call ended, and the silence that followed was heavier than before. An hour passed. Rook, unable to sleep, shifted his position to ease the ache in his leg. As he did, his hand brushed against something on a small, makeshift table near the stall. A stack of old newspapers used to soak up oil. Underneath them was a piece of paper, folded and stained with a coffee ring. It was the foreclosure notice. Rook picked it up. He read the aggressive, threatening language, the names Sterling Development and Marcus Thorne, and the final deadline, tomorrow at noon. Suddenly, the old man's quiet despair, the emptiness in the refrigerator, the offer of his own meager supper, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a farmer having a bad season. This was a man about to lose everything. And in the face of that, he had taken in a stranger, cleaned his wounds, and offered him food and shelter. The act of pure, unadulterated decency struck Rook with the force of a physical blow. In his world, strength was loud and confrontational. But this old man's strength was quiet, resolute, and deeply honorable. It was a kind of strength Rook hadn't seen in a long time. It was the strength of dignity. He looked at the notice again, the name Marcus Thorne burning in his mind. He'd heard that name before. Sterling Development was notorious for its ruthless tactics, for crushing small landowners who got in its way. Rook felt a slow, cold anger begin to build in his gut. This wasn't just business. This was a bully kicking a good man when he was down. He pulled out his phone. The signal was weak, but he found one bar. He made a single, brief call. His voice was low and gravelly, the words few but packed with authority. "Roadblock," he said into the phone, using his road name. "I need you to round up the chapter, every last brother. And I need you here by sunrise. I'm sending you a pin. No questions, just ride." He ended the call and deleted it from his history. He placed the foreclosure notice back where he'd found it. He then settled back into the hay, but not to sleep. He was standing watch now. The barn was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was a fortress, and he was its first guard. The old farmer had shown him what honor looked like. Now he was going to show the farmer what loyalty looked like. The first hint of dawn was a fragile gray line on the horizon, slowly pushing back the inky blackness of the night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and new beginnings. For Silas, however, it felt like the end. This was the day. Noon was the deadline. He rose from the kitchen table where he had kept a sleepless vigil all night. His body ached with a fatigue that went bone deep. He moved to the stove and put on a pot of coffee, acting out of a habit ingrained over 50 years. As the coffee percolated, filling the small kitchen with its rich, familiar aroma, he heard it. At first, It was just a low, distant hum, almost imperceptible, like the buzzing of a single bee. But it didn't fade. It grew steadily, insistently. It was a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate up through the very soles of his worn boots. He walked to the front door and opened it, stepping out onto the damp porch. The sound was louder now, multiplying, layering on top of itself until it became a thunderous roar that shook the air and rattled the leaves on the trees. Silas looked toward the county road that crested the hill a half-mile from his farm. And then he saw them. One by one, they appeared over the rise, black silhouettes against the pale dawn sky. A single headlight, then 2, then 10, then 20. An endless procession of motorcycles, their engines roaring in a synchronized, deafening chorus. They moved not like a random group of riders, but like a disciplined army on the march. Chrome glinted in the growing light. The men riding them were large and imposing, clad in leather vests adorned with patches he couldn't make out from this distance. They flowed down the hill like a river of black steel and leather, turning onto his long, muddy driveway without hesitation. Silas stood frozen on his porch, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this Thorn? Had he sent thugs to intimidate him? Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. He instinctively took a step back, his hand reaching for the door. But then the lead rider pulled up in front of the barn. It was Rook. He had shed the mud-caked jacket from the night before and now wore a leather vest, a cut, with a terrifying screaming skull emblem on the back and the words Hell's Angels arched over it. Patches denoting his rank as president adorned the front. He swung his good leg over his own bike, which must have been brought by his men, and stood with an air of absolute command. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at the long line of bikers now pouring onto the farm. There were dozens of them, maybe more than 50. They filled his driveway, his yard, the space in front of the barn. They parked their bikes in neat, orderly rows, the sound of the engines dying down one by one, replaced by an intimidating collective silence. The men dismounted. They were a fearsome sight, bearded, tattooed, scarred. They were giants, warriors from a different tribe. But they weren't chaotic. They moved with a quiet, unnerving purpose. They didn't speak. They just stood by their bikes, their arms crossed, their gazes fixed on the farmhouse. They formed a silent, immovable perimeter, a wall of flesh and loyalty. A few of them, without a word, went to Rook's wrecked motorcycle in the ditch and, with practiced efficiency, lifted the massive machine and loaded it onto a trailer one of them had towed. Rook finally turned and looked at Silas. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. We are here. Silas stood on his porch, the forgotten coffee pot boiling over in the kitchen, and stared at the army that had assembled on his land. He didn't understand what was happening, but the fear began to recede, replaced by a profound, bewildering sense of awe. These were not Thorn's men. These were Rook's. And they were standing with him. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the night's mist. The Hell's Angels remained in their silent formation, a stoic and intimidating honor guard. Some sat on the fenders of their bikes, cleaning a piece of chrome or quietly talking among themselves. But their collective attention remained focused outward, watching the road. They had created a fortress around Silas's farm. At precisely 11:30, a convoy of 3 vehicles appeared at the top of the hill. Marcus Thorne's black sedan, a dusty sheriff's department cruiser, and a van from a local law firm. They drove down the road and slowed as they approached the farm, their occupants clearly stunned by the spectacle before them. Thorne's car pulled to a halt, and he got out, his face a mask of arrogant confusion. The sheriff, a man named Brody whom Silas had known for years, got out of his cruiser, his hand resting nervously on his sidearm. Thorne strode forward, his expensive suit looking laughably out of place amidst the mud and motorcycles. "What in God's name is this?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. "This is private property." Rook stepped forward from the line of bikers, moving with a slight limp but with an aura of undeniable authority. He was taller and broader than Thorne, and his presence seemed to suck the air out of the space between them. "It is private property," Rook said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. "And we're guests of the owner," Thorn scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "I don't know who you people are, but you're trespassing. I have a legal matter to conclude here." "Sheriff, do your job." Sheriff Brody took a hesitant step forward. "Folks, I think it's best if you—" His voice trailed off as several of the bikers turned to look at him, their expressions flat and unreadable. Brody was a small-town sheriff, used to dealing with speeding tickets and the occasional bar fight. He was utterly out of his depth. Rook ignored the sheriff and fixed his cold eyes on Thorn. "Your name is Marcus Thorn. Sterling Development. You like to buy up family farms by threatening old men." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Thorn's face paled slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a standard business transaction." From his porch, Silas watched, still wrapped in a state of disbelief. Rook reached into his vest and pulled out a small, stale piece of bread, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. "Last night, I crashed my bike in that ditch. This old man," he said, nodding toward Silas, "who you're about to throw out of his home, found me in the storm. He brought me into his house, cleaned my wounds, and gave me a place to sleep. He didn't ask who I was or what I was doing. Then he gave me his supper." Rook held up the piece of bread. "He's got nothing left. You and your bank are about to take it all." And he gave a complete stranger his last piece of bread. He let the weight of his words hang in the air. The bikers behind him were silent, but their collective stare was a palpable force. "This man," Rook continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more menacing, "has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire soulless corporation. He showed me respect. And my brothers and I, we repay respect." He took a step closer to Thorn, who instinctively recoiled. "I'm Rook, president of the Hells Angels. And these are my brothers. We've decided to take an interest in the well-being of Mr. Silas Blackwood and his property. So let me tell you what your new business transaction looks like. You're going to get in your car. You're going to drive away. You're going to call your bank and tell them the foreclosure is off. And you are never, ever going to bother this man again. This land isn't for sale. Not today. Not ever." Thorn was speechless, his face a mixture of fear and impotent rage. He looked at Sheriff Brody for help, but the sheriff just shook his head slightly, his eyes wide. "This is a civil matter, Mr. Thorn," Brody said, finding his voice. "These men aren't breaking any laws by being here. I suggest you leave." The truth of Silas's quiet sacrifice, his simple act of humanity, had been laid bare not by him, but by the most fearsome man Thorn had ever seen. The humiliation Thorn had inflicted on Silas in the diner was now being returned to him 100-fold, in front of an audience of leather-clad enforcers. Thorn stared at the wall of bikers, at Rook's unyielding gaze, and he knew he was beaten. Thorn sputtered for a moment, his well-practiced confidence completely shattered. He looked from Rook's granite face to the silent army of bikers, then back to the sheriff, who offered no support. Defeat settled over him like a shroud. Without another word, he turned, stalked back to his sedan, and got in. His lawyer and the deputy followed suit. The convoy turned around in a wide, clumsy arc and drove away, their retreat a stark admission of powerlessness. They disappeared over the hill, leaving only the quiet hum of their fading engines and a stunned silence in their wake. The tension that had held the farm in its grip for months finally broke. Silas felt his knees weaken, and he leaned against a porch post for support, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bikers didn't cheer or celebrate. Their victory was a solemn one. Rook turned to face them. "All right," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "You heard the man. Let's get to work." What happened next was a blur of organized, purposeful activity that left Silas speechless. The bikers, this intimidating force of nature, transformed into the most efficient work crew he had ever seen. They broke off into groups, each seemingly knowing its task without being told. One group, led by a massive biker with hands like sledgehammers, descended on Silas's broken-down tractor. They opened the hood, their tattooed arms disappearing into the greasy engine cavity. Their talk was a low murmur of technical terms: carburetor, spark plugs, fuel line. Within an hour, the tractor's engine, silent for over a year, sputtered to life with a plume of black smoke, then settled into a steady, healthy rhythm. Another group of bikers fanned out across the property line. They systematically pulled up the surveyor's stakes, tossing them into a pile like discarded bones. They then began mending the sections of fence that had fallen into disrepair, their movements quick and practiced. They replaced rotten posts, strung new wire, and soon, a sturdy, unbroken line secured the perimeter of Blackwood Farms. Two bikers got on their motorcycles and roared off toward town. They returned an hour later not in a car, but in a large flatbed truck from the town's hardware co-op, followed by a pickup from the grocery store. The trucks were laden with supplies. They unloaded bags of feed for his few remaining chickens, sacks of potatoes and flour, crates of fresh vegetables, and enough canned goods to stock his pantry for a year. They brought new tires for his ancient Ford truck and installed them on the spot. They brought gallons of paint and began scraping the peeling facade of his barn. They moved with a quiet dignity, a shared sense of purpose. This wasn't charity. It was a payment. It was respect made tangible. The people of Harmony Creek, drawn by the earlier spectacle of the confrontation and the subsequent roar of the tractor, began to emerge. They gathered at a safe distance, their cars lining the road, watching in stunned amazement. The fear that had kept them silent was replaced by a dawning sense of shame, and then by a profound admiration. They were witnessing the very definition of community and loyalty they themselves had failed to provide. Silas just stood on his porch, watching it all unfold. Rook walked up the steps and stood beside him. He didn't say a word for a long time, just watched his men work. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet. A man's home is his castle. Ought to be treated as such. Silas finally found his voice, though it was thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you. Rook shook his head. Don't thank us. You earned this. You reminded us what's worth fighting for. By late afternoon, the farm was transformed. The fences stood tall and strong. The barn, its new coat of deep red paint still drying in the sun, looked prouder than it had in decades. The tractor sat in the yard, gleaming and ready. The pantry was full. The woodpile was stacked high. The bikers had worked tirelessly, fueled by water and sandwiches one of them had procured from town, refusing Silas's offers of what little he had. As the sun began its descent, casting a warm, golden glow over the revitalized farm, the work was done. The bikers began to gather their tools, their movements as orderly as their arrival. They regrouped by their motorcycles, a sense of completion settling over them. Silas walked down from the porch, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He approached Rook, who was overseeing the final packing. The two men stood facing each other in the yard, the old farmer and the biker president, two patriarchs from vastly different worlds, bound by an unspoken code of honor. You'll be safe now, Rook said. It was a promise. Thorne won't be back. And if he is, or anyone like him, he pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his vest pocket. You call this number, day or night. Someone will answer. Silas took the paper, his hand trembling slightly. It was just a phone number, but he knew it was the most powerful insurance policy in the world. Rook then turned and walked to his bike. He unstrapped a small bundle from the back. He walked back to Silas and held it out. It was a brand new leather vest, clean and unmarked, without the club patches of the others. It was simple, sturdy, and dark. This is for you, Rook said. Not for you to wear. Just a reminder that you're not alone. He didn't hand it to Silas. Instead, he walked up onto the porch and draped the vest over the back of Eleanor's empty rocking chair. It was a deeply symbolic gesture, a shield placed over the heart of the home. Rook gave a final, sharp nod to Silas. He then turned to his men. Let's ride. A thunderous roar erupted as 50 engines fired up in near-perfect unison. The sound was no longer intimidating. It was a declaration of victory, a hymn of loyalty. One by one, the bikers pulled out of the driveway, their headlights cutting through the twilight. They formed their long, disciplined line and rode up the hill, a departing army leaving peace in its wake. Rook was the last to leave. He paused at the end of the driveway, turned to look at Silas one last time, and raised a single, gloved fist in a gesture of solidarity. Then he too was gone. The roar of the engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound and peaceful silence. Silas stood alone in his yard, the air still vibrating with the memory of their power. He walked to the porch and gently touched the leather vest draped over Eleanor's chair. It was heavy, real. He looked out at his land. His land, now secure, its borders reinforced by an unlikely brotherhood. He was still a simple farmer, a widower on a piece of ancestral soil. But he was no longer a victim. He was no longer a relic. He was a man who had earned the respect of warriors, a quiet king in his castle, protected by a legion of unseen angels. The lights in the town of Harmony Creek began to twinkle on, and for the first time in a long time, Silas Blackwood felt like he was a part of the world again, his quiet dignity not just intact, but magnified.